Willkommen, welcome, bienvenue. I'm the Associate Executive Director of Canada FBM 2021, who curated this week the literary programming that went on in this pavilion and worked on the awesome pavilion design. Before we go any further, this is going to be our last literary event in the pavilion. So I really want to thank the stage manager, Benjamin Huppé, the soundman, Reynald Flugel, the entire team of Matane Production led by Fred Lalonde, the people you see that are greeting you at the door, led by Isabelle Ménard, and especially, the translators who are working in the shadows to bring our Canadian stories to you in the language of your choice. So thank you very much. And now, la pièce de résistance of the week. A conversation with Michael Crummy, my crush of the week, sorry, Holly, in a conversation led by Liebe Angela Spitzig. There will be a book signing a few minutes after the conversation in the foyer. Et maintenant, sans plus tarder, j'inviterai nos invités à venir nous joindre sur la scène et je vous souhaite une excellente session. Merci.
Here you go. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this gentle introduction. Hi there, Michael.
Hello again.
You're bringing two books today.
Yes.
You're bringing Die Unschuldigen, The Innocents. Yes, we're still with English here. And you're bringing Sweetland. Die Unschuldigen has appeared in the Eichborn publishing house just this year. And it's perfectly translated by Ursula, Ute Leibmann. Excellent. And this one is a bit older. I think you wrote it in 2014 or so.
I think that's right, yeah.
And it was published by the Mitteldeutscher Verlag. It may even be possible that the publisher is here. If so, I greet him. And again, another beautiful book, beautifully translated, which draws us into the world of Newfoundland. So one more thing, Jennifer said, this is actually the last session, the last discussion here in the pavilion. And the nice thing is, I was the one to start it Wednesday noon with Katrin Mavrekakis. Then we too had a debate with Katrin Mavrekakis on the big stage. And now here you are the one to close. So it feels like a wonderful circle, like pieces falling into the right places. And I want to thank everybody that Jennifer has thanked, except I just have to insist one more on the translators, on the interpreters. They had such a hard job to do, sitting in their boxes, and they did it so well. And I tell you, for European people used to French, the Québécois is a very special challenge. So they did it beautifully. So thanks to them as well, again. So, Michael, Sweetland was published in 2015. So chronologically, it's before The Innocents.
Yes.
But we'll still start with The Innocents today, on the one hand because it's your latest book, but on the other hand also because, in a way, in history, they come before Sweetland.
Sure. And I think the books kind of bookend each other a little bit.
Yes.
Because The Innocents takes place at the turn of the 18th century, around the time when Europeans were first really settling in Newfoundland. Mm-hmm. And I realized when I started writing the book that most of the characters in the book are not Newfoundlanders, actually, but Europeans. People who had come over from England or Ireland or other places to fish in Newfoundland. So the children, the brother and sister, are the start of Newfoundlanders as a distinct entity. Mm-hmm. And in Sweetland, it's kind of, it's a story about resettlement, where small fishing communities that are disappearing in Newfoundland because the cod have been fished out. And Sweetland, the character, is kind of the last of the old-time Newfoundlanders who was born in a fishing village, grew up fishing, that was all he knew, and his world is disappearing. So they do kind of bookend each other in that way.
Yes. So we learn what's in between, but we still have to find out what comes in the future.
Sure.
Very interesting constellation. As you mentioned, your book is about two siblings, a brother, Everett, and his younger, 11 years old, and his younger sister, Ada. The smallest girl in the family has died, and so have the mother and the father. And those two children, quite young, before puberty, live alone in this very hostile, rough kind of climate and nature. And could you just, because we're mapping Canada by its literature here, where could we Germans who've never been there put our finger on the map? Where's Newfoundland, and what could one say about it, just in a few general
Right.
terms?
Well, Newfoundland is the far eastern part of Canada. It's an island out in the middle of the North Atlantic, basically, and it's closer to Europe than to most of Canada.
Really?
So
Okay.
St. John's, the capital city, is about as close to Dublin as it is to Toronto. And because it's out in the middle of the North Atlantic, and because most of the weather, especially on the East Coast, is affected by what's called the Labrador Current, which is this cold water coming down from Labrador, the weather's fairly miserable. I think that's a probably fair thing to say about the weather. It's the nickname for it is the Rock, and it's basically a big granite rock. Like most of the topsoil was scraped away by glaciers, so it's very hard to grow vegetables there. So the only reason Europeans settled there at all was because of the abundance of the codfish.
Yeah.
And right up until my father's time, that was an incredibly difficult, unpredictable, often dangerous way to try and make a living in the world. And
Because
these
the ocean is also very rough.
the ocean
that
is it's the only source of wealth, and it's also it could kill you in an instant, really, and that is not an uncommon thing. Even shortly before we came over here, there were two fishermen who had been washed overboard from their boat and drowned. You know, that's just a part of how people have lived there for the last 400 or 500 years.
We'll possibly find out some of the characteristics just by talking about your two books, but you can imagine what a dangerous and atrocious situation this is for two children who have just been bereft, who are utterly alone in that kind of hostile environment. And I mean, all they can do is try to get fish, try to cultivate the land, that rock where all the topsoil has flown off.
And they were 11 and 9 when the book starts.
Yeah.
And I didn't pick those ages by accident because my father was born in 1930 in a small fishing outport called Western Bay. And the way that he was raised and the life that he was raised in the 30s into the 40s was not a lot different from the way Newfoundlanders had been living for a couple of hundred years. And he started fishing with my father down in Labrador when he was 9 years old. But he always said he never took on a full share of the crew until he was 11.
Okay.
So at 11 years of age, he was a full shareman on his father's fishing crew. So I thought with this brother, with Everett and Ada, at the age of 11 and 9, they would have been involved in the work of the fishery from the time they could walk, and they would know enough about it and have enough skill at that point that it wouldn't necessarily follow that they would starve to death, like that they would have a chance to survive there.
So it's not a fairy tale. So it's really something that could have been realistic, and actually something. Well, how did that topic come to you?
Yeah, well, it is based on a true story, sort of. At least the seed of it is a true story. I spent a lot of time in the Newfoundland archives in St. John's because a lot of my books are historically based, and I'd like to go in there and just poke around. It's full of, there are thousands and thousands of amazing little anecdotes and stories, and about 10, 12 years ago, I was in there researching a different project altogether, and I happened upon like a one-paragraph anecdote. And I can't remember if it was from the clergyman or someone was reporting having heard from the clergyman, but it was a story about a minister, a church minister, who was traveling around Newfoundland. So this was way back in a time when most Newfoundland communities were too small to have a church. And so the clergy traveled to minister to people. And in the course of his travels, he happened upon this tiny cove where a brother and sister who had been orphaned were living alone. And it was obvious to him that the sister was pregnant, and he assumed, and I'm sure he was right to make this assumption, that the brother was the father of the child. Now, being a clergyman, of course, he immediately started preaching at these kids about how awful this thing was that they had done, so much so that the brother got a rifle and drove the clergyman away. And that was it. That was the only information in that anecdote. And when I read that, I knew immediately that there was a story to be told there. Yeah. But my second thought, which followed very quickly on the first one, was I don't want to go anywhere near that story. Like, I'm not touching that.
Well, we can be very grateful you did. And I think the names, of course, Ada and Everett, are not quite coincidental. And because Michael, in his books and stories, he often uses telling names. So, for example, the sailing ship that comes by the bay or the cove twice a year to bring some food, some provisions, is called Hope. And later on, there's another ship which will make a big difference in the storyline, which is called Medusa, and that has quite a lot of raucous persons on board. So naturally we think of Adam and Eve, except that this paradise is not a very friendly place. So of course the title Innocence made me think of William Blake, Songs of Innocence and Experience. So in that paradise, in that stark, rough paradise, what's the experience? At what point do the children learn things like guilt and shame? First of all, where do they get values living by themselves like that?
Well, I mean, I did think of them as an Adam and Eve couple in a way, because Adam and Eve are kind of dropped into the middle of this world that they didn't create, and they have been given enough knowledge to survive, but they're really blind to their own natures, right? It isn't until they eat from the tree of knowledge that the scales fall from their eyes and they realize they're naked, and they start to feel shame about being naked. And I thought of Ada and Everett as being thrown into a similar situation. It's hard to think of Newfoundland at the turn of the 18th century as Eden, but they're sort of left at a time when they've been given a certain amount of knowledge that will allow them to survive. But it's before any of these changes that come to all of us as we move out of childhood into adolescence have started. So they're completely blind to their own natures. And in a way, the novel is we're following these children as they're exposed to more and more of the world, and as their own nature changes completely. And we watch the scales fall from their eyes, and they are forced to try and figure out, who am I? Yes. And how does what I'm becoming relate to this person that I have loved all my life? Yeah. But now I'm separated from, in some way, by my desires and by my inability to talk to that person about those desires. Yes. And that's where the shame comes in, I think.
And maybe we should leave the rest not to the imagination of the listeners, but rather have them accompany the children in this very delicately described process.
I think what she's saying is you have to buy the book if you want to know more about what happened.
Oh, I was just being so elegant about it. No, but there are also other scenes in this book which I just wanted to point to. For example, and I was talking about values. Maybe that's the question with which we can discuss that. Scene. The girl, Ada, she collects things from the beach, stones and pebbles and little eggshells and feathers. And at some point, they come upon an indigenous grave where she finds a bone carving that appeals to her, that's so beautiful. And she takes it, although her brother has told her not to. So why does she do that? And what does this tell us about Ada?
Well, Ada and Everett, as young children especially, kind of see each other as extensions of each other. And as the book progresses, there are a bunch of ways in which it becomes clear to them that there are significant differences. And one of the ways that they recognize early on, Ada has an artistic nature. And I remember years ago reading about early settlers in Newfoundland who lived in these hovels with dirt floors. And that in a lot of these awful little habitations, the women near the hearth would draw designs in the sand. And I was so struck by that desire to have beauty, to have art in your life, even in circumstances as mean as that. So I knew when I was writing this book that I wanted one of these children to represent that desire we have for art and beauty.
Yes.
And Everett, who doesn't have the ability, is also, he appreciates it and appreciates that in Ada. But as the book progresses, and especially when we get to this moment where they find this grave, and they both feel a sense of reverence. No one has to teach that to them.
Okay.
They know that when they find this grave, they kneel there in silence for a few minutes, right? Because I think that's a natural response. They've watched their mother and father and baby sister die. No one has to tell them that this is a site of reverence.
Thank you.
But Ada, her love for the beauty of that bone carving overcomes any sense of reverence. Everett knows it's wrong to steal from a place like that. She knows it's wrong, but her love for the beauty of that thing is a kind of greed also.
Or desire, let's say desire.
Desire, but she recognizes as the book progresses that desire can tip you over into greed.
You notice that Michael has a very sensitive way of dealing with the soul and with the spirit and with the thoughts of these children. And I would like to ask you, there are of course scenes which are horrible, which are threatening, which are cruel, where those children have a really, really hard time. What was it like for you to write them? Did you have a distance to them, or did it break your heart?
Well, I mean, as a writer, I think there's always a distance, right?
Okay.
Because there's part of you that's always thinking about what you're writing in terms of aesthetics, in terms of, does this present what I want it to present,
Yeah.
you know? So you're dealing with that painter dealing with little details down in the corner, almost that are important to the larger picture. But I do think that emotionally, I mean, the reason I wrote this book, I think, even though I didn't want to, was because I was haunted by those children. And I was haunted by the circumstances they found themselves in. I kept thinking about them in relation to myself and what it was like to be a child becoming an adolescent. And how, even though I grew up in a time when there were resources, you know, a sex education class at school, or a book that my mother forced me to read when I was almost 13. Even though there were places I could turn to kind of understand what was happening to me was that period in my life was the most confusing and kind of terrifying and incredibly lonely time in my life. So I couldn't get past what it must have been like for these children to have these things happen to them with no warning. And nothing to turn to, and having to muddle their way through that.
But you know what? The interesting thing is, you can put yourself into those children's minds because you were 13. But if we now look at your other book, Sweetland,
Right.
we're talking about Moses Sweetland. So his name is Sweetland, and he lives on a little island called Sweetland. Moses, first of all, perhaps another telling name, but he is 70 years old. So how did Sweetland come to you?
Well, the book is about resettlement in some ways. At least that's the setup for it. And resettlement, I'm sorry to have to give you a little bit of a history lesson, but nobody outside of Newfoundland knows anything about this, including people in the rest of Canada. But when Newfoundland was settled, it was settled around about 18,000 miles of coastline, and always in these tiny little villages that were as far out onto the water as they could get without actually being in the water, to be as close to the fish as they could get. When Newfoundland became a part of Canada in 1949, part of what the government had to do was give education, roads, electricity, medical care that Canadians had come to expect to all of these tiny communities, which was impossible. So what they came up with was a resettlement program where they asked or suggested or forced communities to shut down and move to what they call growth centers, which sounds very Soviet to me. But so through the 50s and 60s into the 70s, hundreds of these communities disappeared and people were forced to move to other places. I had always thought that was the end of resettlement. But in 1992, the Canadian government instituted a moratorium on fishing for cod because the stocks were completely depleted. It was meant to be temporary. There is still a moratorium on fishing for cod. So there's no work in these communities. The young people are leaving. And what's happening now is that in some of those places, they're going to the government and saying, give us a package. Give us some money. We will leave here. You won't have to keep the ferry running. You won't have to keep the lights on. So the communities are starting to disappear again. But as long ago as about 20 years, is it that long ago? No, probably 15. I started to hear stories about communities where what the government decided was, yes, we'll give packages to you, but everybody has to sign on. We're not leaving one or two people out here on their own. So I started hearing about communities where everybody had voted to take a package except for one person.
So there were more than one.
Yeah, and some of those stories may have been apocryphal. I don't know how many places where that was actually true,
Yeah.
but as soon as I started hearing those stories, I thought that would be an amazing start for a book,
Yeah.
you know?
All that social pressure.
Yes, and sort of like in those communities, everybody's related to everybody else. If not family related, it's such a tiny community that everybody is completely interconnected. And to have to say no to everybody you know and love who are moving in one direction and stand up to it, I knew it had to be a particular kind of person.
I was wondering, with a strong character or terribly stubborn?
Yeah, what I would say is a typical old Newfoundland man.
Okay. So what other qualities would that person have? I
Well,
mean, because we don't have time to tell the story of
Yeah.
Sweetland right now in the last 5 minutes.
Right,
which are
sorry.
left to us. No, but tell us how you thought of him.
Yeah.
What characteristics you gave him.
Well, I grew up with Moses Sweetland. Not the character in the book, but men like him, all around me. And there was a very particular kind of man and woman as well, but in this case, the man I'll talk about, created by Outport, Newfoundland. And that was someone who had to be incredibly self-reliant, had to be very stoic. Most old-time Newfoundland men are not good about talking about their feelings. They often don't even know why they feel the way they feel.
They don't have the words.
They don't have the words. And part of what comes up in the book is the sense that Sweetland couldn't even say why he's so set on staying. But no one's going to push him off staying where he was born and raised and the only place that he feels like he will ever feel at home. And I knew it had to be a man of a certain age because I wanted Sweetland to be somebody who was born in Newfoundland before it was part of Canada. Like, who represents what Newfoundland was before the modern world arrived. And I guess symbolically what I was trying to say with that is that whatever Newfoundland was before we became part of Canada, before the 20th century arrived, that ends with the 20th century and with the arrival of us being part of Canada. Many, many things about Old Newfoundland are carried forward. Part of who I am, I was created by my parents and the people around them, so I recognize myself in them and them in me. Our kids who had nothing to do with the fishery or outports were created by us, so I see my parents in them. But that old Newfoundland man who grew up in the world that was Newfoundland before 1949. That's done with my parents' generation. And so Sweetland, his decision to stay really is an acknowledgement that he can't survive in the world outside this little island where he was born and raised and created, I think.
But you leave him with dignity. You don't really portray him as a loser. So what made you find these things, these little nuances that make us feel with him and want him to be happier than he is? And
Right. Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I didn't realize this when I was writing the book. But as soon as I was finished, it occurred to me that what Sweetland experiences in the second half of the book, when he's alone on the island and is really struggling to survive on his own, what he's experiencing in some ways mirrors what a person with a terminal illness goes through. Which is an incredibly lonely journey, regardless of whether you're surrounded by people. And as I was writing the book, I was giving characteristics to Sweetland and parts of his history that were taken directly from my father's life, which I'd never done before when I was writing the novels. And I realized after I finished it that I was writing through the process of watching my father die of cancer. So I think in some ways this is a story about resettlement and about Newfoundland. But to a larger extent, on a broader level, it's about mortality, you know? And I've always seen the change in Newfoundland and the end of that way of life almost as a metaphor for our own lives and for our own journey towards our own having to come to terms with our own mortality and the fact of that, just the bald fact that there's no escape from that. And I think that's part of what Sweetland has to deal with at the end of that book, is that there's no escaping. There's a point when he wants to get off the island, right? And when my father was ill, there was a point when he fought really, really hard. And then there was a point where he was like, no, I'm done.
go.
And he wanted off. He wanted off the island.
Yeah.
And so for me, that journey, I think that's where I fell in love with Sweetland, because I was writing about my father, who I loved so much. And I think that's where that feeling comes, you know. Even though we know this is going to end badly for him, I wanted to write a book in which we so much want him to succeed, and we so much want him to keep fighting, even though we know what the end of it will be.
Thank you so much for being so incredibly open, talking about your personal experience. And I think you're helping us so much with this, deal with this question and see how much love there is. And I felt it right away when I read the book. I didn't know this background, but he's a wonderful man. So we have two beautiful children having to start into life and deal with it, and all the things that are guilt and desire and loss and happiness. And we see this man who still, till the last minute, retains his dignity. And I want to ask you one last question. You seem to be, I know I've seen you yet for a couple of days now, or just hours, such a very happy and also person, your own person, self-contained, but also outgoing, with your eyes shining. So
That's my wife laughing over there.
Do you get that from your children? Are they the ones that give you this new aspect, this view into the future? And will that somehow reflect in your next novel that you're probably working on?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I feel like watching my father go through his illness was a very important thing to go through. I think he was somebody I admired more than any other person I've ever met, and somebody I love more than just about anyone else. And up to that point in my life, I was a single guy. I was in my mid-30s. I was a single guy. I'd never committed to anything in my life. Didn't want kids. And I remember saying to my brothers that I thought that that was the closest I would ever come to being a father, because I knew I would do anything for him, for my father. And then after my father died, shortly after, I met my wife and her 3
Welcome.
kids. And, you know, my joke is I had a midlife crisis in reverse. And I went through my entire life, like, just doing what I wanted and committing to nothing, and then woke up one day and thought, if I meet a single mother with 3 kids and a couple of dogs, I'm in. Like, that's more of a real life. And definitely those relationships, like watching those kids grow up and being part of their lives, I think has given me something that I lacked before that. And that's something I'm really grateful for.
But you know, listening to you, the audience is sure to have noticed that even the ending is sad in this book. It's not a sad book. There are so many crazy, funny, outrageous things happening there. You laugh at
Yeah.
the same time. It's a very rich and full book.
Well, thanks for saying that, because I did find that the process of being with my father through that awful
Yeah.
experience, it was incredibly hard and sad, but there was nothing depressing about it.
Yeah.
It was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life, and something I'm really grateful to have experienced. And I felt kind of the same when I was writing Sweetland, that although this guy's suffering and going through, I was grateful to be there with him, and I hope that readers get that same sense, you know, that same sense of admiration and hopefully some sense that life is a beautiful thing and something worth fighting for as well.
What a lovely, lovely, wonderful lesson. Thank you. And please use the opportunity to talk to Michael some more while he's signing your books. They're very precious. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you very
sharing
much.
with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah.